Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch, and I also have the privilege of serving as the chair of the advisory board for the Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict. For anyone who's not already familiar, the Watchlist is a global network of 14 humanitarian and human rights organizations that work together to uphold the rights of children affected by armed conflict and to end violations against them. We're really pleased to welcome you to the launch of Watchlist's 6th annual policy note, A Credible List, recommendations for the Secretary General's 2022 annual report on children in armed conflict. Each year since 2017, Watchlist has published this policy note with recommendations for the Secretary General's annual report, including perpetrators that should be added to his annexes, often called the list of shame. The Secretary General is currently preparing this year's report, which is expected in June. And Watchlist is calling on him to publish a list of perpetrators that is complete, accurate, and based on the evidence collected by the United Nations Monitoring and Reporting Mechanism on Children in Armed Conflict. Watchlist is also calling on the Secretary General to include several new countries that have not previously appeared in his report as situations of concern where children are facing grave violations of their rights. Today, we have a great panel to present this year's recommendations, to speak to several specific country situations and explain why the Secretary General's report is so important. Adrianne Lapar, the director of Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, will be presenting an overview of the report and the importance of highlighting all situations where children are suffering and holding all perpetrators to account. She'll be followed by 2 members of the Watchlist network who will address specific country situations. Bill Van Esveld from Human Rights Watch will speak about violations against children in Ukraine, and HIWOT EMISHAW from Save the Children will speak about the situation in Mozambique and Ethiopia. Finally, Allan Rock, the former ambassador of Canada to the UN, will speak about the particular significance of the Secretary General's report and its annexed list of perpetrators for protecting children in armed conflict. In a moment, we'll hear from the 4 speakers, and after the panel, we will open the floor for questions. At that time, please indicate if you'd like to ask a question, either by using the raise hand function or by typing your question into the chat. And when asking a question, we kindly ask that you identify yourself and the organization that you represent and indicate if your question is directed at a particular panelist. Adrianne Lapar is going to start us off. Adrianne is the director of Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, where she oversees Watchlist advocacy with the UN and its member states, our research on children's rights in armed conflict, and our partnerships with local civil society. Adrianne is going to present an overview of Watchlist's new policy note, including the methodology, key findings, and recommendations. Adrianne, you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. And thanks to everyone here for joining us today. Before I get into the key findings and recommendations of Watchlist's Credible List report, I'd just like to say a little bit about the significance of the Secretary General's annual report. So just would like to say a little bit about the significance of the report and its role in promoting the protection of children in armed conflict. So since 2001, the Secretary General has issued an annual report to the Security Council that details grave violations committed against children in countries affected by armed conflict, and which includes an annexed list of perpetrators. The Secretary General's list of perpetrators, as Joe said, has often been referred to as the list of shame, because nobody wants to be on this list. That creates a real incentive for parties to do whatever it takes to get off the list. So what does it take to get off the list? In 2010, the Secretary General at the time set out specific criteria for delisting. These include the signing and implementation of an action plan to end and prevent grave violations for which a party is listed, and going a full year without committing any new violations. In recent years, however, some perpetrators have evaded inclusion on the Secretary General's list or been prematurely delisted, despite evidence that they have continued to commit violations. We believe this threatens to undermine the list's credibility and weaken its strength as a tool for promoting accountability and compliance with international law. All perpetrators of grave violations need to be held to the same standard, regardless of who they or their friends are. Parties should be included in the Secretary General's list for one reason alone: a pattern of documented UN-verified evidence that they committed grave violations against children in armed conflict. In addition to the annexed list of perpetrators, the Secretary General's report also includes information on new emerging situations. Known as other situations of concern, these are contexts where the broad and effective protection of children is of concern, but where there may not be sufficient verified information to list parties in the annexes. And since taking up his post in 2017, the Secretary General has emphasized the need for strengthening conflict prevention, early warning, and early action. We know that the abuse of children is symptomatic of more complex issues within society at large, such as the breakdown of institutions and security. So in this sense, the Secretary General has a real opportunity to draw the Security Council's attention to emerging situations where grave violations are happening by including them in his report as situations of concern. So with these ideas in mind, Watchlist makes two key recommendations to Secretary General Guterres ahead of the publication of his annual report on children in armed conflict. First, we're calling for the Secretary General to publish a credible, evidence-based list of child rights violators. And second, we're calling for him to include several new situations where children have suffered grave violations. To arrive at our recommendations, Watchlist conducted a systematic desk review of various publicly available reports on 15 country situations, plus the Lake Chad Basin region, for the period from January 1st to December 31st, 2021, which is the period that the Secretary General's report will cover. We ultimately developed listing recommendations on 8 countries and recommendations for the inclusion of 4 new situations of concern. Our sources included the Secretary General's previous annual reports on children in armed conflict, reports from UN agencies, peacekeeping and special political missions, treaty bodies and commissions of inquiry, and public reports from Watchlist members and other reputable international NGOs with relevant expertise. While not setting a standard numerical threshold for our listing recommendations, we did pay particular attention to those parties who were responsible for high numbers of violations, according to the Secretary General's previous annual report. We also considered the number of UN-verified violations committed in 2020 to assess the establishment of patterns or trends. It's important to note that the information contained in our new policy note is not comprehensive, nor is it intended to serve as a complete list of all incidents perpetrated against children in conflicts in 2021. Nevertheless, based on publicly available sources, our research allowed us to formulate the following recommendations. First, where we found sufficient evidence that parties had committed a pattern of certain grave violations in 2021, we recommend that the Secretary General list these 4 government or coalition forces and 2 armed groups in his annual list of child rights violators. Second, where we found credible cause for serious concern for the protection of children, but the information available on specific violations was insufficient to recommend listing, we have recommended that the UN further investigate to ascertain the responsibility of specific parties or factions, and to determine whether they should be listed in the upcoming report. And third, where there was strong evidence of violence in recent years, but where these countries have not been in previous reports, we recommend that the Secretary General include these as other situations of concern. Our report details grave violations against children in 12 countries, but I'd like key. In Myanmar, the Tatmadaw on schools and hospitals in the wake of the February 2021 coup, occupying more than 60 education facilities and more than 50 health facilities by May. In many cases, these occupations also entailed attacks against teachers, students, health workers, and patients, as well as the destruction of property. Although the Tatmadaw is already listed in the Secretary General's report for several grave violations, Watchlist is calling on the Secretary General to also list the Tatmadaw for committing attacks on schools and hospitals. And for years, the Secretary General's annual reports have detailed grave violations committed by Israeli government forces, yet they have never been listed in the report's annexes. Watchlist is especially concerned about the sharp increase in violations that occurred last year, when violence escalated between Israeli security forces and armed groups in Gaza. According to UN reports, Israeli airstrikes killed 66 children and injured an additional 540 in just an 11-day period last May. In addition to those, the UN attributed over 300 child casualties to Israeli forces during the rest of the year. Watchlist is also concerned about grave violations committed by Palestinian armed groups, and we are calling for the UN to further investigate the killing and maiming of children by these groups and to verify these incidents in order to identify which armed groups were responsible. In addition to our recommendations for listing or further investigating parties to conflict for committing violations, Watchlist also recommends that the Secretary General include 4 new situations of concern in his forthcoming annual report: Ethiopia, Mozambique, Niger, and Ukraine. In a moment, my colleagues will speak about these particular country situations, but I'd like to just underscore why their inclusion in the annual report is so important. As I mentioned earlier, the Secretary General has the opportunity to bring situations where children's protection is of concern to the attention of the Security Council. The inclusion of situations of concern ensures that the UN continues monitoring and triggers regular reporting to the Security Council on the situation of children in these countries. Watchlist has called for Ukraine to be included in the Secretary General's annual report each year since we first started issuing the Credible List report in 2017. We have been seriously concerned about the situation of children in eastern Ukraine for many years, particularly given killing and maiming of children and attacks on schools and hospitals. And it's on this basis that we make our recommendation. The current situation in the country only further underscores the need for its inclusion as a situation of concern. This is also the second consecutive year that we're calling for the inclusion of Ethiopia and Mozambique in the Secretary General's annual report. We believe that their omission last year was a missed opportunity to draw attention to the situation of children affected by armed conflict. And lastly, this year we're calling for the inclusion of Niger in its own standalone section, given violations in the southwestern regions of Tillabéri and Thibault. Currently, violations committed in Niger's Difa region are covered in the section of the SG's report on the Lake Chad Basin. So in closing, the Secretary General's annual report, including its annex list of perpetrators, is an important part of the UN's framework for protecting children from the effects of war. The Secretary General's list of shame is an effective tool for incentivizing changes in behavior, and the inclusion of other situations of concern is an important tool for early warning and triggering enhanced monitoring of grave violations against children. Secretary General Guterres should protect the credibility and integrity of the annual report and use it effectively to promote the protection of children in armed conflict on the basis of facts and not politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrianne. As Adrianne outlined, Watchlist is recommending that the Secretary General include Ukraine in his forthcoming report as a situation of concern. And children have been suffering grave violations there since 2014. So next we're going to hear from Bill van Esveld, Associate Director in the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, one of the founding members of the Watchlist network. Bill has recently been on the ground in Poland and Moldova, documenting conditions for children fleeing Ukraine and violations inside Ukraine, including attacks on schools and hospitals. Bill, you have the floor.
Hi very much, Joe. Children in Ukraine have been subject to grave violations since the conflict began in 2014. And with Russia's invasion on February 24th, violations have increased exponentially. Watchlist and its members have called repeatedly over the years for the inclusion of Ukraine in the Secretary General's annual report. The current devastating situation makes it an absolute imperative. As of yesterday, UNICEF reported that at least 104 children had been killed and 230 injured since February 24th. And the actual number was much higher. Children have been killed and injured by the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons, such as ballistic missiles, shelling from heavy artillery, including unguided multiple rocket systems and landmines, all of which disproportionately harm children. Human Rights Watch has documented multiple attacks by Russian forces using cluster munitions, causing dozens of civilian casualties, including an attack that affected a preschool. Given the inherently indiscriminate nature of cluster munitions and their effects on civilians, these attacks may amount to war crimes. Human Rights Watch has also documented Russian soldiers shooting children. On March 6th, Russian soldiers in the town of Vorzel, about 50 kilometers northwest of Kyiv, threw a grenade into a basement and then shot a 14-year-old child who emerged from the basement where he had been sheltering. The child was killed immediately. Even before Russia's invasion on February 24th, more than 750 schools in Ukraine had been damaged or destroyed since the start of the conflict in 2014, disrupting education for thousands of children. In 2021 alone, at least 16 schools and hospitals were attacked. Since February 24, an average of 22 schools a day have come under attack, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Education. During the first week of the invasion, just in Kharkiv, Human Rights Watch documented damage to 8 schools, including a boarding school for blind children. Remaining schools are closed, disrupting the education of millions of children. The World Health Organization last week reported that there have been more than 100 attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, like the Russian airstrike that devastated a maternity hospital and a children's hospital in Mariupol on March 9th. Within the span of a month, over half of Ukraine's children, more than 4.3 million, have been displaced. Displacement poses additional risks for children's safety, including vulnerability to trafficking, exploitation, and other abuses, particularly for those children who are unaccompanied or who have been separated from their parents or caregivers. Damage to water and sanitation infrastructure in Ukraine has left millions without safe drinking water, and shortages and insecurity have severely limited civilians' access to food, medicine, and other essentials. Stores of critical medical supply dwindled, including medicines, first aid kits, midwifery kits, and surgical equipment. For the last 2 weeks, I was in Moldova meeting refugees, primarily women and children who have fled Ukraine. A woman and her 5-year-old son from the town of Pologi in the Zaporizhia district told me how a Russian tank shelled their building directly, despite the absence of any military targets in the area. They had days without heat, running water, or access to medical care. But the forces that occupied the town, including the hospital, did not allow them to leave. United Nations sources have verified grave violations against children since 2014 in Ukraine. Yet the conflict has never been included in the Secretary General's annual report. Documented violations include killing and maiming of children and attacks on schools and hospitals in 2021, the time frame for the Secretary General's upcoming report. Given the horrific escalation of violations in the last 6 weeks, the Secretary General must act urgently to include violations in Ukraine in his upcoming report and to name the perpetrators responsible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Next, we're going to pass to HIWOT EMISHAW. As Adrianne mentioned earlier, Watchlist is very concerned about the situation of children affected by armed conflict in both Ethiopia and Mozambique, and we are calling for their inclusion in the Secretary General's upcoming report. HIWOT is the Regional Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy Manager for Eastern and Southern Africa for Save the Children, which is another founding member of the Watchlist network. She will speak directly about the situation of children affected by conflicts in Ethiopia and Mozambique. HIWOT, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So what I'll attempt to do in the next couple of minutes will be to make the case for why Ethiopia and Mozambique should be included as situation of concern in this report. And hopefully I'll have convinced you by the end of my presentation. So I'll begin with Ethiopia, where I'm based. I'm also Ethiopian. So I've been following the events obviously much more closely. Save the Children has a very strong presence in Ethiopia. We've been here for the last 60 years. We've been delivering humanitarian assistance, long-term development programs for children all across the country. Ethiopia is a very big country. We have 12 regions right now, and we've been operating in all of them. We were also among the first organizations that responded to the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. When I say the northern part of Ethiopia, I'm referring to 3 regions, which are Tigray, Amhara, and Afar, which are all the regions that have been affected by the conflict in the north significantly. We have responded to the conflict situations there, particularly focusing on the needs of children, which gave us the opportunity to assess the level of impact this conflict has had on millions of children in these regions. But overall, in Ethiopia right now, over 30 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. In addition to the conflict in the north, which I just referred to, we have insecurity and conflict, violent clashes in the rest of the country, which are also claiming the lives of children and leading them to experience the worst forms of abuse all over the country. For reference, the population of Ethiopia at the moment is estimated to be 107 million. At the end of 2021, we understand that over 4.2 million children have been displaced from their homes as a result of conflict. This is arguably the largest number of children that have been displaced by conflict anywhere in the world. Families obviously flee with very little. When conflict happens, it happens all of a sudden. They don't have time to prepare. They're fleeing for their lives. So children are completely uprooted from their lives. Education is disrupted. They have absolutely no access to basic and essential human services, which means that in a country like Ethiopia, where it took us decades to make progress on key development indicators such as maternal mortality or infant mortality, development gains that took decades are wiped out in a matter of a day when a devastating conflict like this happens. So the impact of the conflict is not just immediate on children, but we're talking about an impact that will last years to come because children will not have the same access to health, the same access to education, the same access to vaccination, and the same access to social protection in the years to come as we try to rebuild what has been destroyed. So it's a very serious matter also in the long run. In terms of access, as Save the Children, we've been among the organizations, like I said, that have responded to the conflict in the north, particularly to save children that have been facing grave violations there. We've had issues with access, especially when there are currently still ongoing violent clashes taking place in Tigray, on bordering regions in Afar, parts of Afar and parts of Amhara regions. So it's very difficult for organizations like Save the Children to actually deliver aid that could have saved lives, of children. With other humanitarian partners, however, we've been trying to do life-saving assistance, and we've been monitoring the situation for children and advocating on behalf of children to ensure that safe access is provided so we can provide aid that is much needed to save the lives of children and their families in all regions affected by conflict. In Tigray in particular, what we did when accessibility was a difficult issue since December 2021, the road access was completely blocked because of ongoing conflict. So Save the Children took the option of airlifting food supplies and medicine supplies into Tigray in order to continue operating under the circumstances that were available to us. It's also very important that in Ethiopia, although the northern conflict has sort of subsided in the last couple of weeks, given that there was a humanitarian ceasefire which Save the Children welcomed, we still have access issues when it comes to Tigray, Amhara, and Afar regions. And we also have no access to millions of children across Ethiopia, where there are ongoing violent conflicts like in Oromia, in Benishangul Gumuz, and other regions that are currently experiencing conflict. So it's very much an ongoing issue. It's not something that has happened in the past. So we've witnessed as Save the Children, schools have been destroyed, health facilities have been destroyed, education has been disrupted both by COVID and then the ongoing conflict. So we have children, particularly in the northern part of Ethiopia, that haven't gone to school for the last 2.5 years. So you can imagine how devastating of an impact that would have. So as Save the Children, we did welcome the recent humanitarian truce that was announced by the Ethiopian government and the forces that are fighting along the side of the TPLF in Tigray. However, we would like to see more concrete steps being taken to ensure that there is access improvement, there is actual delivery of assistance to the children that are currently trapped in all the regions that I mentioned. In terms of recruitment of children into armed fights, unfortunately, there's very little anecdotal and mostly unconfirmed reports that this has happened in Ethiopia. We've had reports from notable media organizations in the last year about recruitment of children in certain groups. However, there isn't much documented evidence of that happening. And hopefully, if Ethiopia is included in this report as a situation of concern, we'll have the opportunity to verify and document if that indeed has happened. I would like to close the Ethiopia section by telling you my personal experience, because I believe that it's very easy to talk about figures and give you the overall situation report as you are familiar with it, because you've read about this, you've heard about this. But I was up in the north as the situation was really, really bad for children last year. And something that still makes me emotional happened as Save the Children was setting up child-friendly spaces. What we do is we give children an area where they could play and become children again, even though they are in a displacement camp, even though they're staying in one room with 50 adults in an abandoned school. So we are doing that, and we are playing with children, with some of them, and we had some balloons that they had with them. And then in the middle of playing, one of the balloons bursted. And the children, I cannot tell you how fast they ran from that area. I cannot tell you how many of them came to hug me and protect themselves. It's such an emotional experience because these children are obviously suffering from, PTSD. This is something that reminds them of the time when they had to flee, active conflict or shelling. So they still have trauma from that. Some of them have seen family members being killed. Some of them have seen unimaginable, horrific things happening to their families, to their friends. So it's a very real issue. It's beyond the numbers. It's beyond the data. It's beyond everything that we talk about today. It's a very, very concerning situation. Let me move to Mozambique now, where we have a more or less similar situation, particularly in the northern part of Mozambique. The situation there, unfortunately, has been deteriorating significantly as of January 2022. So attacks on civilian facilities that are targeting particularly children have been happening in Cabo Delgado for years now, especially since 2020. And the escalating crisis has seen, a number of a rise of grave violations that are violating children's rights. We've seen children being separated from their families. They don't know where their families are. They're staying in temporary shelters with people that they don't know. We've seen children that were physically harmed as a result of the conflict that was going on. And obviously, a large number of people, particularly over 700,000 people have been displaced as a result of direct impact of the conflict there. And among this, nearly 400,000 are children. So it's a very significant number. And as of January 2022, we've seen, a recent surge of repeated attacks that are still claiming the lives of children. Unfortunately, once again, just like Ethiopia, we don't have consistent data that verifies that these violations are actually taking in a systematic manner. However, Save the Children, as one of the organizations that are currently operating in that area, can confirm that there is enough evidence that children's rights are being violated and the risks are increasing day by day. So what we are recommending for Mozambique in particular is to make sure that there is an enhanced monitoring mechanism and additional resources to make sure that that takes place. So we can document these violations, we can have a sustained source of information, and we bring attention to the situation of children in Mozambique, who are largely ignored at the moment. You don't hear a lot of things being said about Mozambique and Cabo Delgado at the moment, but it's a very serious issue. We've seen that, at least few reports that are official have reported that as many as 51 children have been targeted. They have been, especially girls have been abducted, and we don't know what has become of them. In some cases, these child abductions result in children being forced into marriage, or some of them may be recruited into military fighting. So Save the Children believes that obviously this is a very horrific violence against children. Children and families are being beheaded in their homes, in their own homes. And this has resulted in the increment of armed groups being, much more pronounced and increasing activity. In February, at least 7 children were abducted once again by armed groups this February. So we'd like to bring attention to this crisis. So now I'm just going to conclude for both countries, for Ethiopia and Mozambique. Save the Children is, as a child rights organization that has been working to protect children for the last 102 years, is concerned for the safety of children that are caught in conflicts in both Ethiopia and Mozambique at the moment. We are calling on all parties involved in conflict in both countries to immediately cease hostilities and to ensure that there is access for children to escape, for their families to escape this violence and have humanitarian assistance that they desperately need. And while fighting is ongoing, it's also imperative that this access is granted so organizations like Save the Children can actually deliver aid that both save and sustain their lives. So finally, we also recommend that both Ethiopia and Mozambique must be included in this year's report as other situation of concerns, so that we can highlight the plight of millions of children across the two countries and get the appropriate attention and action they deserve for a healthy life. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, HIWOT. Our final panelist this morning is Allan Rock, who's the former ambassador and permanent representative of Canada to the United Nations. He was also the chair of the group of Friends of Children in Armed Conflict in New York. In 2021, Allan was also part of an eminent persons group of experts who conducted an independent study looking at the Secretary General's annual reports on children in armed conflict across 10 years and making recommendations to ensure that the reports and their annexes are impartial and evidence-based. Today, Allan will speak about why the Secretary General's annual report and its annexed list of shame are such important tools for protecting children in armed conflict. Allan, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. And I express my gratitude to Watchlist and members of the network for their annual, reliable, and meticulous examination of these issues, and your very influential recommendations to the Secretary General. As Joe mentioned, I'm not going to speak about specific countries or situations this morning, but rather about the significance of the list of shame and the crucial importance of maintaining the integrity and credibility of that list. It's now been about 25 years since the systematic efforts to put in place a framework of Security Council legislation and practices to protect children in armed conflict. And the list is an integral part of that essential framework. And make no mistake, it's a very effective tool. I can remember when the monitoring reporting mechanism was being considered and then adopted by the Security Council, the amount of lobbying done by certain member states who didn't want to see it put in place because they knew the power of the list. And if you need any evidence about how powerful the list of shame is, all you need to do is look at the efforts made by some member states to get themselves off that list. And you'll see that the power of naming and shaming, officially naming and shaming, is enormous. I've seen it work for myself as special representative of the SRSG for Children in Armed Conflict in Sri Lanka. I negotiated action plans with 3 parties to that civil war, and I saw how anxious they were to avoid being named and the steps they took to do so. And indeed, look at what happened in 2016 when Secretary General Ban Ki-moon removed Saudi Arabia from the list. The blackmail, the conduct of Saudi Arabia in getting itself off that list, what further evidence do you need about the significance of being named and shamed? As Joe mentioned, last year, I formed part of a group that took a critical look at the Secretary General's annual report over a 10-year period. And we compared the information and evidence with respect to the conduct of parties on the one hand, and the question whether they were listed or delisted on the other. And by the way, we were working from evidence that had been gathered by the United Nations itself, that had been checked and double-checked and verified by people on the ground. And what we found was quite shocking. There was a disparity, a marked disparity between the evidence and the listing. There were glaring omissions. There were cases in which parties had been responsible for hundreds of violations in the previous year, and their name did not appear on a list. There were cases in which parties had been responsible for hundreds of violations, and their names had been removed from the list. And so we made strong recommendations to the Secretary General that the credibility and integrity of the list be restored by working from evidence and fact rather than political influence and considerations in determining who gets listed. We found that in the period 2015 to 2020, for example, there were over 6,000 cases of child casualties arising from the operations of the Israeli government forces. Israel was never listed. We found that in 2020, the Secretary General removed the Tatmadaw in Myanmar, notwithstanding documented evidence of hundreds of violations the previous year. You know, it's impossible to listen to my colleagues on this panel this morning as they describe the horrors facing children in so many states around the world, so many conflicts, without feeling emotional, without feeling angry, without feeling helpless. But the fact is, we're not helpless. And the United Nations is not powerless. The United Nations has in its hands a tool that can be effective in influencing the conduct of those who are killing, maiming, and otherwise abusing children. And it's enormously important that the power of that instrument not be diminished because it's corrupted by political influence. You would think, looking around this world with all the issues that we quarrel about, all the subjects that separate member states of the United Nations, that notwithstanding all of that, surely there's one thing we can agree on, and that is that we shouldn't be killing children. Don't you think that would be the basis from which we proceed? Let's make sure it is, and let's make sure that we try our best to influence the Secretary General and the whole infrastructure at the United Nations to make certain that the list of shame is able to achieve its important and fundamental purpose, and that is to change the behavior of those responsible for the horrors we heard described this morning. So let's all make the case as loudly and as strongly as we can to the Secretary General and his team to make sure that that list remains credible, and the people or the parties who appear on that list are there because of the evidence and the facts, so that we can do what we can to protect the children in those conflicts. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much, Allan. We'll now open the floor to questions from participants. Please feel free to either use the raise hand function or to use the chat to pose your question. And again, just a reminder, please identify yourself and your organization and let us know if there's a particular participant that you'd like to direct your question to. Anyone from the floor? Bethany, please go ahead.
All right, thanks very much, Joe, and thank you to all our panelists for your moving and very informative presentations this morning. I'll maybe open with a question directed at our director, Adrianne Lapar. For maybe those who are in the audience here who might be a little bit less familiar with the specific mechanics of the annual list and the children in armed conflict structure and the tools available, could you tell us a little bit more about what exactly happens concretely when a situation is added as a situation of concern? Thank you.
Thanks, Bethany. Over to you, Adrianne.
Great, thanks so much, Bethany. Hopefully that helps to break the ice, and we hope to get some other questions and comments from the floor. So that's a great question. So the inclusion of situations of concern, as I mentioned, can occur when there's information that grave violations are occurring in a particular country, but there may not be sufficient information about the perpetrators to lead to listing of them. But it's important because when a situation is included, it triggers enhanced monitoring by the UN. Of course, the UN should be monitoring any human rights related developments, including grave violations against children in countries around the world, but particularly when they're included in a situation of concern that can funnel more resources and attention. And also it puts that particular situation of concern in the SG's annual report and therefore on the Security Council's Children in Armed Conflict agenda. That will trigger more regular reporting to the Council that could include through quarterly reports that council members receive, but also the annual reports that the Secretary General publishes and which are available to the public. And that gives a basis for then the UN's engagement and particularly the Security Council's greater attention to that situation. So that's really why we feel it's very important that several of the countries we've described today, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and also Niger, particularly the southwestern region, be added as situations of concern in the forthcoming annual report. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrianne. I see Thibault from the Mission of France. Please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Joe, and thank you everyone for this very important event. We're always very glad to participate and really want to commend you for all the hard work, everyone on this call, both in New York, but of course on the ground. Of course, I think we fully support the different recommendations that you're putting forward. We agree with you of the power of the list and the need to make sure that we do not undermine this fundamental tool of the CAC agenda as set out by different resolutions we adopted together. I understand that we're talking now about the 2022 report, but I was wondering if we could also think about next year's report, and if you could remind us maybe of the different listing criteria, which are the grave violations that, if confirmed, could potentially force a listing of certain parties. And of course, thinking about the situation in Ukraine, and what would it take for parties concerned to be listed next year? I wanted to know if you could remind us of these listing criteria. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Thibault. So we'll call on Adrianne to respond to that one about the listing criteria and what violations we might see perpetrators added for in 2023. But Adrianne, I wonder if I can actually add something to the question. And traditionally, parties or conflicts are included in the body of the report before parties are added to the annex. But there have, in fact, been precedents for new conflicts being added to the report and perpetrators listed in the same year. So I wonder if you might comment on that as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Thibault. It's great to see you here. Appreciate the question, and Joe, thanks also for the additional points. So just as a reminder, so the criteria for listing parties are basically the five of the 6 grave violations, which through various resolutions the Security Council has made into what we call trigger violations, in that they should trigger listing perpetrators in the annexes of the SG's annual report. So those are killing and maiming of children, recruitment and use of children, sexual violence, rape and other forms of sexual violence, abductions of children, and attacks on schools and hospitals. And as we outlined, I know Thibault, you mentioned specifically regarding the situation in Ukraine. We have seen over the past 8 years in Eastern Ukraine, killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and hospitals. And so that's why we're very concerned that we do believe grave violations have been occurring there. And as you rightly noted, the current situation, what's occurring in 2022, we're also seeing some indications that many of these same violations are occurring, and perhaps others. So that would merit additional information next year. And with regard to Joe's question regarding precedents, so we did look through previous annual reports to see if there is precedence for immediately a situation going from not being in the report to being included with listed parties. And when parties are listed in the annexes, that triggers the establishment of a formal monitoring and reporting mechanism in the country. And so in 2014, Nigeria first appeared in the Secretary General's annual report, and that is also the first year that Boko Haram was listed for violations. So I think there's perhaps a misconception that a country would first need to be included as a situation of concern before it would be possible to list parties. It's rather regarding what kind of information is available to ascertain the responsibility of perpetrators for violations and determine listing.
Okay, thanks, Adrianne. We have a question from Amelie with the mission of Germany to the UN. She's curious about the monitoring and reporting mechanism for the countries of concern that we've identified, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Ukraine. What do we know about what kind of monitoring is currently implemented and what kind of MRM might be put in place going forward? Adrianne, do you want to start? And I wonder if HIWOT and Bill might also want to comment.
Sure, thanks. A great question, Amelie. So this is, again, maybe something a bit technical in the weeds, but feel free to reach out to Watchlist anytime you have any technical questions on the CAC agenda. So the MRM in capital letters is a formal system that is set up once parties are listed in the annexes of the Secretary General's report, and that triggers the establishment of the MRM, as I said, with capital letters in that country. So in those countries that are currently included in the SG's report as situations of concern, so that includes Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, Libya, India, among others. These countries don't have formal MRM with those capital letters, but rather they have other systems for monitoring and reporting where the UN country teams should be monitoring violations. So in the case that Ukraine, Ethiopia, Mozambique, or Niger were to be included as situations of concern, this should enhance monitoring, but formal. So I hope that helps to answer the question. Regarding current efforts, I believe that they mentioned the UN does have a responsibility to monitor rights violations in countries where they're, including through OHCHR country office presences. So I believe those efforts should be ongoing.
Thanks, Adrianne. Bill or HIWOT, do either of you want to add a word about what you've observed in terms of UN operations and documentation that's ongoing on the ground?
Thanks, Joe. I don't have much to add, just to say that there is, of course, a lot of deep concern. There have been and are teams on the ground of people conducting war crimes investigations. So I think that would be, in addition to, just to add to the United Nations monitoring that may be happening, there's also foreign and ICC monitoring of war crimes going on. So this could be an area of information sharing.
Great, thanks, Bill. HIWOT, anything to add?
Yes, for Ethiopia, there was a joint investigation that was conducted into alleged violations of human rights and children's rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia last year. It was conducted with the Ethiopian Human Rights Council. It's widely available online if you'd like to see that full report. After that, the Ethiopian Human Rights Council has also released a similar report that was conducted into violations that took place within the Amhara region by TPLF forces. So there are different, types of reports that come out from different bodies, but these are the notable ones that I can remember now. Thank you.
Thank you, HIWOT. We have a question from Nisreen from the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security in Canada. And as we've noted earlier, this is the 6th annual policy note from Watchlist directed towards the Secretary General's report. And she's asking what lessons we've learned from the previous Watchlist reports and how have we learned about making them more effective in influencing what the Secretary General includes. Adrianne, can we go back to you?
Great, thank you. Sorry, just jotting things down quickly. So yeah, that's a great question, Nisreen. So we've definitely one key point is also looking at the advocacy that we do. The credible list report, as you know, this is the 6th year we're publishing that, but Watchlist has long advocated for a credible evidence-based list, even before 2017 when we started publishing this policy note, and that's been also through our bilateral advocacy with the SG's office, with the SRSG's office, and other parts of the UN system, in public statements, press releases, and more public advocacy. And so this is one aspect of that. And over the years, we've also developed other forms of advocacy, working also with Watchlist network members and broader groups of civil society to highlight particular grave violations that we've seen happen over the years. We've also worked with partners in other sectors, such as working on attacks on healthcare, to highlight attacks on schools and hospitals within the context of the CAC agenda, and to shed light on those violations. So I think those are a few of the kind of key lessons, and also leveraging different forms of our advocacy and that information and making it available to the UN and also to member states. And just to say, I mean, we see there's many member states who are joining this presentation today. We're really happy to see that. And of course, member states also play an important role in expressing their support for the Secretary General's independence and impartiality, and also to express support for the SG to make politically difficult decisions and make sure that they are based in evidence. So to have the political courage to do so. So I think that expression of support is something that member states can do to support this system.
Thank you, Adrianne. I see a hand from Alison Griffin. Alison, go ahead.
Hi everyone, really interesting discussion, thank you. So I work for Save the Children UK, and recently our Foreign Secretary has described the situation in Ukraine as a paradigm shift, I guess, in terms of geopolitics. So I just wondered, in terms of the political saliency or the opportunity of the report, is the panel hopeful that next year we can see far more unification around having children front and center, and around this sense of humanity that we can all agree that children should not be violated in the ways that they continue to be violated?
Thank you, Alison. I am happy to put that to any member of the panel who'd like to pick it up?
Can I speak to that, Joe?
Yes, please go ahead, Allan.
I think that Alison has raised a very good point. You know, in our busy lives, it's easy to not have the opportunity to pay attention to what's going on in conflicts around the world. Many of the conflicts that have been mentioned here this morning, or that we've dealt with in the past, have not had the attention they deserve. But there's something about the current conflict in Ukraine, its proximity to Europe, the involvement, the high profile involvement of Russia, permanent member of the Security Council, and both the major media and social media depiction of images showing some of the events that Bill and others have described. It has really captured the attention of the world. And one would hope that, you know, given the pictures of the smoking ruins of the maternity hospital, given the stories such as those that Bill mentioned this morning of the 14-year-old being shot to death emerging from the cellar after the grenade was thrown in, surely that's going to mobilize public opinion. And nationally and internationally, there's going to be a demand for the United Nations and all of its mechanisms to take these issues seriously and do whatever can be done. First, to hold accountable those responsible, and then to influence practices so they change. So I think there is a sea change going on here, and it's not fair. It's not fair or rational, because the horrors that face children in many other countries are no worse or no better than what we're seeing in Ukraine. But the profile of these abuses is such that we may be able to mobilize public opinion this time in a way that we haven't in the past.
Thank you very much, Allan. I completely agree that the current moment and the attention on Ukraine does give all of us an opportunity to really revitalize all of the tools that we have available to us for accountability on violations against children. And we certainly hope that the Secretary General will do everything within his power to do so with his upcoming report. We're at time, and so we're going to close the meeting now. We have the full report, the credible list policy note, and the press release noted in the chat. You can find the links there, or you can also go to the Watchlist website for both of those products. And I want to thank our panelists for the excellent presentations this morning. Thank you very much. And also thank you to all of our participants for joining us this morning and for your commitment to the Children in Armed Conflict agenda. Thanks very much. Have a good day.